Welcome, everyone. I am Jim Burke. I'm the CEO of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And as many of you might know, we are a 48-year-old global Jewish advocacy
Went down.
organization. And we're focusing on combating anti-Semitism and hate. We're defending the state of Israel and its right to exist and using the lessons of the Holocaust to promote empathy and tolerance. I'm very pleased to be with you today for what marks the beginning of an ongoing series of timely conversations with experts on current events that are going to affect the Jewish community and beyond. So for today's discussion, we're going to focus on the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran and its far-reaching geopolitical ramifications throughout the region and the world. We're honored to welcome two renowned Iran experts from the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer and Behnam Ben Taleblu. It's going to look to be an outstanding conversation, and I'd like to get right to it. Moderating today's conversation is an award-winning journalist and a communications expert with extensive experience as a correspondent and producer for Reuters, CBS News, and CNBC, among many others, and nearly a decade of which she spent stationed in the Middle East itself. So to get started, please join me in welcoming Simon Wiesenthal Center's Head of Global Communications, Deborah Camiel. Deborah, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Over the last 2 weeks, the world and all of us have witnessed a historic clash between Israel and Iran, the outcome of which isn't yet entirely clear. During that time, dozens of targets in Iran hit daily by Israel, hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones launched at Israel, 28 Israelis killed, 3,000 wounded, all of the fatalities except for one civilians, Iran reporting hundreds of deaths, and finally, on Sunday, a U.S. strike. Today, Jonathan Schanzer and Behnam Ben Taleblu are going to help us make sense of everything that has transpired. Jonathan is the executive director at FDD. He previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where he followed and froze the funding of Hamas and al-Qaeda. Jonathan has held research positions at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the Middle East Forum, and has written hundreds of articles on the Middle East and U.S. national security. Behnam is senior director of FDD's Iran program, where he specializes in Iranian security and political issues. Previously, he worked on non-proliferation at an arms control think tank in Washington. He closely tracks a wide range of Iran-related topics, including non-proliferation, ballistic missiles and drones, sanctions, the IRGC, the foreign and security policy of the Islamic Republic, and Iranian politics. We are so glad to have both of you with us today. For guests, we're going to try to fit in some questions at the end, so you can send us those through the Q&A feature. And in the meantime, let's dive in. We are now 2 weeks into this confrontation, a warfare, a sort of spate of warfare that began with a fairly jaw-dropping operation by the IDF, the Israeli intelligence and Air Force. Can you start out by talking a little bit about why Israel chose this moment to hit and how that initial strike played out? Jonathan, you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. Great to be with everybody, and an honor to appear alongside my very talented colleague, Behnam. Look, the simple way of describing this is this was a highly coordinated sequence between Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. If you look at what happened when Donald Trump was elected, everybody, I think, in Israel and many people in the United States expected there to be an immediate confrontation. After all, the Iranian regime had tried to assassinate Donald Trump. He had this history with them from the prior administration, where he was putting maximum sanctions pressure on the regime. He ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the most powerful, the most important general in the Iranian regime's military command structure. And it really did look like the table was set. But Donald Trump, I think, surprised a lot of people by saying that he wanted to give diplomacy a chance. And he dispatched Stephen Witkoff, his envoy, to begin to engage with the regime on the possibility of a nuclear deal. And the idea was is that he told the Iranians, he said, I'm going to give this 60 days and I'm going to expect you to come through with a deal on the other end. Well, during that time, it was, I would say, very stressful for those of us who were watching this, and perhaps Behnam can speak to a little bit of that. The kind of the back and forth and the prevarication that we saw out of the U.S. side, and the frustration being voiced by the Israeli side, and it really just looked like we were right back at the sort of we're right back to the kind of patterns that we've been watching in years past, where the Iranians were eating our lunch at the negotiating table, embarrassing the United States, and we're capitulating. Well, it turns out that I think a lot of that was theater, because on day 61, after the Iranians failed to reach an agreement in those 60 days allotted by the president, the Israelis start attacking. And it's a surprise attack. They launch drones from within Iranian territory. They're launching their F-35s, scrambling out of Israel. Of course, the Israelis had already knocked out the air defenses of the Islamic Republic, almost all of them, back in October of last year. And so what we really learned was that the Israelis had spent the previous 8 months or so preparing intensely, probably years before that, setting the groundwork for what was to come. And then on that day, they went on this blitzkrieg offensive. It was very reminiscent, by the way, of the 1967 Six-Day War. This idea of, taking it to the enemy on the enemy's turf. This is very much the doctrine of the IDF. Rapid fire victories on the ground, keeping Israel far from the fray. Of course, Israel started to pay a price in terms of those ballistic missiles, and we can talk about that. But the launch of this war, the execution of those opening salvos, unbelievably timed, remarkable in execution, and certainly gives one a sense that the Israel of old, these storied histories of Israeli prowess on the battlefield, completely restored here. But I think now, as we look back on those 12 days, the question is how to lock in those gains, and I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yeah, we will. Right. It's interesting, that military tradecraft, right? That after those catastrophic failures on October 7th, it seems like this is the other end of that spectrum, right? Maybe eye off the ball on Gaza, but completely locked in on Iran. Behnam, can you talk a little bit about that initial strike and how it, Israel definitely taking power of the whole airspace, not losing any pilots, quite remarkable.
It's an excellent it's an excellent question, and thank you, Deborah, for hosting us. And Jonathan, it's a pleasure to share the virtual stage with you, even from within the same office. I know there's been a lot of media debate about the timing leading up to that operation. Jonathan clearly mentioned that 60-day window. I think President Trump was very serious about this 60-day window, so much so that I think our inability as just outside observers, foreign policy analysts, Iran wonks, just average Americans, what have you, to process that tells us much more about us than it does about him. And how he may have indeed telegraphed this, and our inability to see it coming led to it actually yielding a strategic surprise. This may have been the case with the Iranians as well. I think the Iranians have been lulled into at least 4 or 5 presidents saying that the Islamic Republic can't get a nuclear weapon. At least 4 of these presidents saying that all options were on the table. And then these patterns that Jonathan talked about manifesting themselves at the negotiating table again, or on the sanctions side again, allowing the Iranians to consistently enter with a weak hand and leave with a strong hand. And I think the Israelis, while talk is, prevalent in this town about them sensing an opportunity when it comes to stopping that third critical element of developing a nuclear weapon, which is weaponization, given the stories we saw in 2024 about the Iranians engaging in these dual-use experiments that even a deal, in our view, as fatally flawed as the JCPOA in Section T even sought to prohibit. I think this is missing the forest through the trees here. The Israelis, post-October 7, in my view, had a change in philosophy with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they realized that I think the Iranians post 9/11 in the Middle East had a strategy of being able to fight a limited war without paying the cost of a limited war against them. And whether you look at the way the Israelis over the past few years prior to 10/7 were talking about the octopus doctrine, or the way the Arabs were talking about going after the head of the snake, there was at least some really creative thinking, critical thinking done to find a way to take it, as Jonathan mentioned, to the enemy. And when you look at the first few sets of targets the Israelis went after, whether you're talking about the nuclear scientists or what we call the commanding heights of Iran's military brain trust, the IRGC folks, two individuals in particular, in most, autocracies, you tend to have bloviation in elite military command. You tend to have not experienced people. You tend to have ideologues. In fact, during the Cultural Revolution in the 1980s in Iran, there was a phrase, taqwa na tavano, which means zeal, not competence. People are promoted on zeal and loyalty, not necessarily their performance. There are some people in that commanding heights, however, that, with respect, I feared for their competence and their zeal. We've seen someone like the commander of the aerospace force, Hajizadeh, take this Iranian ballistic missile program and turn it into a battlefield weapon that we've seen since 2017, increasingly fired from Iranian territory. We've seen, folks like at the helm of the Armed Forces General Staff basically coordinate better with all these very diffuse, coup-proof branches of the Iranian military. And given the experience, the taste the Israelis had of the military successes that redounded to their conventional and technical and intelligence-based advantages, both in April and in October of 2024, the Israelis, I think, were willing to sink the cost and take the fight to the enemy, such that they had a clear shot. And if I had to, build a cocktail of reasons as to why this happened now, the primary ingredient would be the clear shot. The fact that the proxy network is down, but it's not out. The fact that if left unmolested or unimpeded, the weaponization effort will creep along. The fact that Israel realized Iran will land blows when it comes to ballistic missiles, but they will not be death blows. The fact that they have a permissive environment with the current political atmosphere in the White House and in Washington. And of course, the fact that, the Iranians, if caught by surprise, just like the, June 1967 situation Jonathan mentioned, would be off balance in the early parts of the war. And that lack of balance would yield what you've seen during the Cold War with the Arab armies Israel faced, which is short, sharp victories that are brought to you by technical prowess on the top and intelligence sophistication on the bottom. And together, we've seen in the past 12 days that prove that there is a tier 1 military capability and a tier 3 military threat.
That's so interesting. Talk a little bit more, if you would, Behnam, about those targeted attacks on prominent Iranians in the military, in science. Who was taken out, and what was the strategy behind that?
I think the desire of going after these targets, by the way, at roughly the same time on June 12, June 13, I remember it because I couldn't believe it. I was actually hosting a dinner party for an American diplomat friend on my roof, and I just left them there. And I came home to follow exactly what was going on, because you couldn't believe the stories coming out first on Persian social media, then in the English language press about, again, the commanding heights, the names that if you were an Iran watcher, you were watching drive the evolution of the Iranian threat. These were the people that were playing to the edge. These were the people that were dangerous because they had that combination of zeal and capability. Someone like Hajizadeh, for example, he's been the commander of the aerospace force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps since 2009. There is a lot of talk, and I'm not saying I'm behind a lot of the talk, but there is a lot of talk that says that this person is the next Soleimani, or could have been the next Soleimani when it comes to the evolving threat vector that the Islamic Republic poses. That guy's terror proxies, this guy's long-range strike. And together, they form a symbiotic relationship that has the offensive and defensive elements of Iranian security policy. And just like we never really knew after January 2020, when Trump killed Soleimani, the net effect, the psychological, the political, the strategic net effect of not having Soleimani at the helm until you got to the post-10/7 Middle East, we won't know right now in these 12, 13 days since early June what the net effect will be about not having the guy who drove the precision project for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force. Out of all those individuals killed, I think Hajizadeh is the one that will really leave the deepest cut. He is replaced by someone, Majid Mousavi, who, if you follow the Iranian press, seldom talks. But when he talks, it's a gold mine for Iran analysts and Iran wonks and missile military watchers, because he is the last of that generation with Hajizadeh that worked with this guy that was the father of the Iranian missile program that was killed in what many believe was a sabotage attack or an accident back in 2011, that was part of the effort by Iran to build a ballistic missile arsenal in the middle of the Iran-Iraq war, going to Syria, Libya, North Korea, and laying the foundation for what still is, even post this operation, the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. And the Israeli targeting of the men at the commanding heights of that network meant that that network could not function well in the immediate aftermath. And what you saw with the targeting after of the material was the Israelis flipped the script on the Iranians, where the Iranians had the quantitative advantage, but that quantitative advantage was used against them. If you don't have the right command, you can't make the most sense of a ballistic missile volley. And then once you do, reestablish command with the deputies in the next generation, once you do fire the volley over a protracted period of time, when the Israelis have the full air defense, airspace cover, they will target the launcher. So you could have 1,000,000 missiles, but if you don't have a single launcher, you will always be put to the choice. And you see the Israeli military machine driving the Iranians to make mistakes because of the lack of these men, married by the lack of the material.
So interesting. Brains and brawn. It was fascinating to me that they could get to all those guys with such precision.
There's a separate story there. I'm not going to wax on about it, but it is why human rights, Jonathan, forgive me for going so long, it is why human rights and popularity and legitimacy is security. If anyone has seen the TV show Tehran season 1, season 2 on Apple TV, there's a whole host of random Iranians that they're not Mossad agents, but they tend to just lend a helping hand to Mossad efforts. And the fact that, as Jonathan mentioned, the Israelis created a drone base in Iran, and the Iranians have been failing at discovering and detecting and thwarting that drone base, tells you, with a people as nationalistic as the Iranian people, the permissive environment to do this tells you so much about the sentiment and why human rights and popularity and legitimacy are not and ought not to be treated as the soft issues totally unrelated to security. The regime paid that price.
Wow, fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about the Iran's counterattacks. These were big missiles with big warheads, as big as 250 pounds. It seems like quite a different type of attack than we saw from Iran last year. Is that correct to say?
It actually, they're very similar to what we saw from last year.
Okay.
But I will tell you this. I've been in Israel during lots of different kinds of attacks. Salvos from Lebanon, salvos from Gaza, the one-off ballistic missile from, the Houthis in Yemen. I was in Israel last week when this war began.
Wow.
And, when we first went to shelter, middle of the night, I heard the siren out in the distance before my phone started blaring. And I immediately just went to the stairwell, which is, it's one of the places they consider safe in most structures in Israel. And, I started sort of scrolling through my phone to kind of figure out where this was coming from, what the issue was. But I mean, there have been times where I've slept through Houthi rockets, or Houthi missiles, just thinking, what are the odds? But once I started to realize what was going on, I realized it was in a very different situation where there would be salvos of dozens or even hundreds. I mean, it turns out that they fired something like more than 500 ballistic missiles. These are weapons that are the size of a bus. And, we're talking about hundreds of pounds of explosives, as you suggested. And you could see the damage that they were able to do. And so even though Israel has this unbelievable air defense system called Arrow 3, and it intercepts ballistic missiles, and even their mid-range system somehow, and I've yet to actually get a good explanation from the Israelis, but David's sling, which is mid-range, also apparently intercepted some of these. And I don't know how that works, because I didn't think they could reach that high. But regardless, they did an excellent job. I think it was something like, 80 to 90% of those that were fired by the Iranians, that they were intercepted. But man, you could see what happened when they didn't intercept. Huge craters entire buildings having like like a full wall shorn off. The direct hit went right through the shelter in a lot of these buildings. In other words, there's nothing that you're going to be able to do if it's going to hit you directly. Doesn't matter how thick your walls are, you are about to sustain serious damage. So the Israelis took it on the chin here. I mean, I was seeing that there is going to be billions of shekels in damage, billions of dollars in damage, and it will take some time to rebuild. I did hear, though, and this is interesting, that even as they sustained this significant damage, and even as there were, I think it was 29 dead, and I think more than 2,000 injured, and a lot of people displaced, and a lot of people with PTSD and everything else, that the damage was far less than what
Yeah.
they had expected. That the actuarial estimates that, and I was talking to an Israeli contact this morning about this, their estimates were that it was going to be triple, quadruple. And there's one real reason why. When they gamed out their war scenario with the idea that they would probably have to attack the Islamic Republic, they believed that they were going to have to do it while the other proxies were still solvent. So Hamas, Hezbollah, the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, all with mid-range, short-range missiles. And you could imagine what the airspace would have looked like had Israel not been fighting for 600 days. The fact that Israel over those 600 days had taken it to Hamas and Hezbollah, that the Assad regime collapsed, that the Iraqi militias had been deterred, it made it such that the Israelis had a clear path to Iran, and that they could track the missiles coming in, that the skies had not darkened with all of these different projectiles coming from all of these different proxies. So, it's funny, we've been talking about it this way for some time, and it seems weird to say it out loud still, that Israel was lucky that it sustained the 10-7 attacks. Not because, Israel was lucky that it lost, 1,200 souls on that day, or that 254 hostages were taken, but that what it did is it actually gave them an opportunity to go one by one and to dismantle these threats. For some reason, these fronts did not unify. And I think at some point we'll learn what happened, but it seems that Hezbollah decided to just decline to engage for reasons that, I think are probably in the grave with Hassan Nasrallah right now. But the Israelis were lucky. And as a result, they could fight back. They could destroy each one of these proxies one by one. The fight's not entirely over. I mean, the Houthis fired a UAV at Israel earlier today. Yesterday, even hours after the ceasefire had taken hold, the Iranians purportedly fired 2 UAVs that were also shot down. So in other words, we're still, and 7 Israelis were, tragically killed this morning in the Gaza Strip. So the fight is going to continue. But when you look out now at everything that Israel's been able to accomplish, unbelievably remarkable, just breathtaking when you think about where they were on October 7th and where they are now.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that was a pre-October 7th assessment about the level of casualties that, and what accounts for it is all of the work essentially Israel has done between October 7th, 2023 and now.
Yeah, and I think there were revisions before they launched their strikes too. And I think they needed to, or they wanted to try to stay under that, whatever that threshold was, and I'm sure it's very classified. I'll tell you, for me, being in Israel when this was all going down, the moment where I realized I was leading a delegation of journalists, and the moment that I realized that we probably needed to leave was when missiles were getting through, in increasing numbers. And in some cases, I started to wonder whether the Israelis, in order to conserve their strategic missile defense, were allowing certain missiles to get through to small towns. And and I knew that was an inevitability when I was speaking to Israeli war planners about this for years leading up to this conflict. FDD's been preparing for this moment for a long time, and we've talked to them about all the different scenarios that we would see. And one of them was that after the Arrow 3 stocks had dwindled to a certain point, they were going to have to let some get through if it looked like maybe they wouldn't create as much damage, because they needed to save these the interceptors for strategic sites, Dimona, the Kiryat, the chemical plant in Haifa, the oil refinery, which apparently was hit anyway. Ben Gurion Airport for sure, right? I mean, these are strategic pieces of infrastructure that needed to be preserved. It wasn't hermetic, and the Israelis always say that there are no hermetic defenses for things like ballistic missiles, but they were expecting far worse. And I got to tell you, just having witnessed the Israeli public in the bomb shelters while we were there, the patience, the defiance, the just the willingness to fight on in the name of something bigger than the individual was truly inspiring. And they had full faith in their government, which was they were making these brutal decisions, and it really was remarkable to watch.
Yeah, I mean, some Israelis were killed, as you said, direct hits, I think, killed 7 Israelis in 2 different direct hits. But you do have moments as you're watching all of this play out when you realize what Israelis, the military, the intelligence, and the general public are just capable of withstanding. They've gone through 20 months of war, and you just have to, as you're watching everything go down, you recognize their resilience. And I'm sure that's something that has struck all of us. It's interesting, 28% of Israelis don't have safe rooms or shelters that they can run to within a minute and a half or a couple minutes after getting an alert. That's a lot of people in the last couple weeks sleeping in parking structures and underground train stations. But if we do a split screen, Behnam, and look at what's happening on the Iranian side of this war, this warfare, where they don't have that type of infrastructure, they don't have alerts from the regime. What has this experience been like for Iranian civilians?
Well, it's been a horrible experience for Iranian civilians, regardless of political orientation. And I want to stress that because multiple times Tehran was struck, both military and political targets. But bombs don't necessarily discriminate. Shrapnel doesn't necessarily discriminate, and particularly in a political environment like the street of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is so anti-state, and as we mentioned before, so permissive of things that could also be anti-state as well, even up to when they're foreign to a certain degree. It was an experience unlike anything else because so much of the Islamic Republic's security doctrine is driven also by a never again moment. The last major conventional conflict on Iranian soil was actually the longest conventional war of the 20th century. That was the Iran-Iraq War, where there was chemical weapons used on civilian population centers, ballistic missiles. And in response, everything that post-Iran-Iraq War that we have had as a security issue from the regime today was something that was birthed during that war. The ballistic missile inventory, the first use of drones, the transnational terrorism threat, the interest in a nuclear weapons program, the maritime aggression, all of those things are things with their roots in the 1980 to 1988 war. But something else with its roots is the assumption that the regime had that the population, even when hit, would stay as long as they would on the side of the regime. And because of the lack of those things that you pointed out, particularly the shelters, particularly the fact that everything that had been taken away from the Iranian street and sacrificed on the altar of not the national interest, but the regime interest, and that yielded years of protests where individuals were saying, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life only for Iran, wanting a more Iran first foreign policy rather than this revolutionary Islamist foreign policy that's arm, train, and equip all of these terror forces. The Iranian population began to see, when they had internet, because that was cut as well, that all of these things were going up in smoke, that securitization that the regime had obsessed about, that little bit of hair, of Mahsa Jina Amini's hair, that caused the security guard to beat her to death. All of those things that were done in the name of security did not yield security, neither for the regime nor for the people. And you exactly are right to mention the split screen, because Iranians had about 2 or 3 options here because of the lack of these shelters, even in big urban environments like Tehran. One, of course, was to go to metros or mosques. Metros were safer because they were underground. The other was, of course, to try to flee. But of course, Tehran on a good day has a heck of a lot of traffic. And whether you're fleeing to the north or to the northeast, as many individuals did, or try to go to a suburb, but although some suburbs were struck as well, you ran into traffic jams where people just abandoned cars because they ran out of fuel on the road. Ultimately, after a few days, Tehran in some parts did look like a ghost town. But for those that were too old, but for those that who feared movement, those who couldn't get out, it was shelter and pray, and ultimately try to avoid death. But avoid death by staying still. And you saw the commentary and the vitriol on Iranian social media, particularly Telegram, bring some of the messages from the street against the state to the public. And one of them was just cursing the regime for saying, we don't even get to know where the strikes are coming. The Israelis have to tell us. The adversary is telling us. So even where the regime had marginally been successful of blurring the nationalism and the Islamism and the populism during a period of foreign attack, even then the right was criticizing the regime in Iran for even that lack of preparedness. So you couldn't have a stauncher, sharper split screen.
Yeah, that's stark. There's, at the moment, even this morning, there's conflicting messaging about how much damage was actually inflicted on Iran's enrichment program, its nuclear ambitions. I'm sure everyone here is very curious to know how you are interpreting what you see and the available, crisscrossing of stories and the available information. Can both of you speak to that?
Sure. I can start. I'm sure Behnam has additional insights. I mean, first, let me just say that the word obliterate is not something that is used in a BDA, in a battle damage assessment. Many of you may have heard that Donald Trump could be prone sometimes to exaggeration, or going beyond what normal people might normally say about such things. And so his initial assessment was, wildly optimistic and not really rooted in the kind of language that we would hear. The next assessment that we got was from the Pentagon. That was Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and his generals some 12 hours after the strike was reported. It was more muted in their description of what happened, and it was more of an interim assessment, which is exactly what you want to hear. But these things take some time. It requires satellite imagery and human intelligence and signals intelligence and seismic measurements and all sorts of things that it's going to take a little time for us to figure this out. Now, people have been wildly optimistic about everything that happened just by virtue of the fact that it was these massive U.S. planes carrying massive U.S. weapons that penetrated this mountain where Fordo, the nuclear facility, was located, and two other sites where they used bunker-busting weapons, which only the United States has, and it was certainly a dramatic moment. I think from all indication right now, the weapons entered into the mountain and into these other sites exactly as they were supposed to. And there's no indication of weapons malfunction. And what we don't have, though, is any knowledge of exactly, did the ceiling fall to the floor in the cascade hall of the centrifuges, for example, at Fordo. These are things that I don't think anybody can answer right now. And I think over time, we'll probably be able to figure them out. But I will just say this, that the media environment here in the United States is insane. It's so hyper politicized. You've got people cheering against the neutralizing of the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism because they have Trump derangement syndrome, or people just simply believing that we've defeated Iran because Trump. Right? Neither one of these are based in reality. And then you have the leak. And the leak that came out of the DIA yesterday, I have to say, as someone who was held a clearance in the US government, whoever did that needs to lose their clearance and probably go to jail. You don't share classified information in a public setting, period. End of story. And whoever did leak that had a political axe to grind as well. I think they're trying to undermine the president's narrative. Look, the way that I look at it is this. The president's narrative is going to be undermined by facts, or it won't. What I hear out of Israel right now is that it's not as bad as the DIA estimate was, and it's also not as good as Donald Trump's estimate is. In other words, it's somewhere in between, which is where I would expect things to be. It wasn't a perfect strike. It sounds like it was more than adequate to destroy the vast majority of the nuclear program that Iran had established. Are there things that we still can't account for? Absolutely. There is 60% enriched uranium that people can't seem to locate. That doesn't mean, though, that Iran is going to be able to convert that into a weapon, because they can't convert it to metal, and they don't have the conversion facility any longer because the Israelis bombed it. And, you know, to be able to convert that into a warhead without the nuclear scientists who've all been killed, you get a sense of how challenging all of this would be. It doesn't mean that, you know, we're out of the woods, but what I would just say is we should give this probably another day or two, and we'll get more information, and eventually I think we'll have a pretty clear picture. But this media environment is not helpful right now as we try to parse through the information that we do have.
Behnam, can you talk to the same question a bit?
Sure, just a few footnotes to that. I actually wholeheartedly agree with what Jonathan said, and you know,
Which is rare. No, I'm kidding.
no, great minds think alike. I just wanted to add a few footnotes to that because, you know, watching how the Iranian press has been watching our press has been problematic for me. The fact that they can foot stomp this, they can screenshot the CNN story, they can screenshot stories about the DIA report, which, by the way, Jonathan mentioned the leaker, whoever that individual or that cast of characters was, because there was apparently 4 people, unnamed sources, in that initial CNN story. They clearly made the rounds, giving different pieces. It was like a Rubik's Cube of information of that report to different news agencies, and CNN clearly had the exclusive. But when your adversary is able to take a leak from your own intelligence organization and use it against your own president, regardless of your views on the number of intel orgs we have, regardless of your views on the actual president, that's a problem. That's a problem because it actually undermines your own deterrence. And it erodes confidence in the military tool, which, again, to go back to what we were saying very, very early at the top of this conversation, has allegedly always been on the table, because every U.S. president since the post-Cold War period has talked about, you know, trying to prevent the world's foremost state-sponsored terrorism from getting nuclear weapons. So this kind of conversation, this kind of hair-on-fire approach to it, this kind of TDS, or like, you know, TDS or he is God phenomenon, these extreme approaches really only hurt the analytical product of whatever needs to come in the full battle damage assessment, and then also gives a shiv to our adversaries to stick at us at any time of their own choosing. Because when we fight each other like this, it's not the left that wins, it's not the right that wins, it's our authoritarian adversaries that win. And that's a playbook that is not just in the hands of Ayatollah Khamenei and what's left of his Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, but of Vladimir Putin, of Xi Jinping, of the Kim dynasty. These are their on-ramps into our society and into our politics. So we have to resist the temptation and guard against that. And I'm saying that proudly at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, because it takes good, you know, individual democratic character, lowercase d, to guard against that.
Yeah.
That's the,
you know,
personal
one thing,
responsibility element.
Yeah, one thing I just want to add to what Behnam has said, and I think he's 100% right, is you have to understand the context in which all of this is occurring. That there was a battle that was going on leading up to Donald Trump's decision to intervene and to drop these weapons, and it's been brewing for some time now. I mean, it actually predates the Trump administration, but we see a fairly sharp schism within the president's base right now. You know, broadly speaking, people are talking about neo-isolationists on the one hand, and, you know, internationalists on the other. And the internationalists are the sort of traditional Republicans who think that America, you know, can and should use force for good to support our allies and to support a US-led system that has served humanity unbelievably well for the last century, give or take. You have this new crop of isolationists, and many of them are in the Pentagon, by the way, which I think is just something to keep in the back of our heads as we watch these debates play out. But they're making the argument right now that America has no interest in the Middle East whatsoever, and that we should be focusing all of our attention on China and this new great power competition that is emerging on the world stage. And I'll just say that at FDD, we have a different construct here, and that is that we see China as a threat, but we also see Russia and Iran and North Korea as a threat as well, and we see them as being part of an interconnected axis. They are a united front against the United States and our allies. And so if there's an opportunity to work with allies like Ukraine or like Israel, to be able to weaken one of the legs of this four-legged stool, that it is inherently a positive thing, that America benefits from countries like Israel taking it to one of the Axis powers. That's not how it's being viewed right now in certain quarters of the Pentagon. And there are people who are lamenting the idea that the United States would have even gotten involved in the, I mean, I don't want to say that it was small because they were 30,000-pound bombs, but this was an isolated attack. It's not like we've got boots on the ground. We're not trying to build democracies, on the sands of the Middle East and all of these sorts of, lamentations that we hear about foreign policy past. But this is an essential component of the debate that's playing out, and it may have actually contributed to the leak in some shape or form.
So I just want to go back to one thing I think you said. So I'd like you to discuss a little bit more than given that split in Trump's own base, the calculus that led him to back up Israel by actually making that strike, right? Recently, we've seen, or we've thought we've seen, some daylight between him and Netanyahu on various, right, in the last few months.
Yeah.
So can you just return to that to be a little bit
Sure.
more detailed about how you're seeing that how Trump's makes that decision on Saturday night, Sunday.
Right. So, I mean, look, I think a couple of things. Number one, I do think that some of the tensions that were being reported prior to the American attack were political theater. And I think it was misdirection. I think the two of them knew that this was going to happen for quite some time. And I think Donald Trump threw a couple of head fakes at the Islamic Republic, and I think they bought it. I think that he outplayed them in several important ways. I do think that there was real tension the other night between Trump and Netanyahu after the Iranians violated the ceasefire, and the Israelis were, absolutely loaded for bear, and they were not going to let the Iranians get a last lick in. That the Israelis were saying, no, we get the last word. We beat you fair and square. You don't get to fire that last missile. And so, ultimately, I think Donald Trump relented and gave the Israelis an opportunity to go hit some kind of useless radar somewhere out in the sticks of Iran. But I do think that, when you ask what the logic is, here's where I think we just need to be very, straightforward. There is no Trump doctrine. There is no written Trump foreign policy in the Middle East. This man enjoys maximum flexibility in order to make deals, in order to get out of deals. If he wants to bomb a country, he can. If he doesn't want to bomb, he doesn't have to, and he can engage in diplomacy. The flexibility that his non-committal approach to foreign policy, that flexibility is crucial for him. It's actually what makes him very unpredictable. It makes him harder for his enemies to predict, but it also makes it harder for Americans to predict. And so, I mean, I thought it was very instructive that, there was this sort of battle that took place between Trump and Tucker Carlson, who, as I like to call him, Turkey Catarlson, seeing that he doesn't have any qualms about, getting in bed with some of these Islamist countries that are only quasi-allies of the United States. But, Tucker went after him, basically saying that, this isn't MAGA. And Trump said, I get to decide what MAGA is. And that, I think, sums it all up. In other words, don't question his decision making as to why he attacked Iran. He gets to attack Iran. He went in and he said at the beginning of his time in office, he said he's not going to let Iran get a nuclear weapon. And then he stood behind it. And what's kind of amazing is that his base, I mean, Trump is sort of like, he's a Rorschach test, is what I've been saying. You look at like these little dots and squiggles, and you see in that what you believe is MAGA. You discern from whatever you're looking at. That's what I think the foreign policy is. And then Trump can surprise you. And he has. And I think he will continue to do so. Look, I think he did something that was incredible the other day. I think that it was something that presidents had only talked about, and it really was all bluster. Democrats and Republicans alike had failed to put their money where their mouth is. This man had an incredible spine. But, if you're asking for a written doctrine that explains why he did it, I think you're going to keep looking.
Agreed. And everything changes every day. I think that's the other thing.
It does. It
right?
does. And as we say, Trump giveth and Trump taketh away. Say thank you when he giveth.
Right. Ben, we've heard a lot about, one of the other, big discussions of the last few days has been the issue of regime change. How has, you look at Iranian internal politics, how has the regime of Ayatollah Khomeini and emerged from this episode? How is it looked at in the Iranian public right now? And can you also talk about whether the IRGC was degraded and how that is now positioned after everything that's transpired?
Sure. So, we probably don't have enough time to even get into the full regime change debacle, an issue. It's certainly a hangover here in Washington. It's a hangover that I think our adversaries understand and puts real political handcuffs and blinders on sometimes when we're looking at the threats coming out of the Middle East and what our priorities are, because governance is about applying your capabilities towards those priorities. You have to rank order them. You have to choose what to do and what not to do. And I'll tell you also, just as a first-generation Iranian American, I'm getting kind of sick of everyone saying, no regime change in Iran because of Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. And there was a critical difference between those. Those were conflicts with states or terror states where there was an element of a regime change that was foreign imposed. What you've seen on the ground time and time again, 1999 to 2009, the rise and fall of the reform movement, 2009 to 2015, 16, 17, a whole series of labor strikes that set the predicate, the overpromise and underdelivery of reform, 2017 to present, widening geographic and demographic protests that continue up until this day that push past reform and seek wholesale revolution. And in Iran, there is nothing about foreign imposition, about regime change. In Iran, it is entirely about will foreign actors support local efforts for regime change. That is the fundamental difference. Iran has the second oldest constitution in Asia. Iran has a 100+ year history as a society of trying to seek representative government. Iran is a country on the map today that is smaller than it's ever been in recorded history, at least in the past modern history since the 1500s and the contemporary era. All of these things add to a sense of nationhood and add to an opportunity for the U.S. to flip the script when you also layer on the fact that this is the most pro-American, pro-Israeli population in the heart of the Muslim Middle East today, led by the most anti-American, anti-Israeli government in the heart of the Muslim Middle East today. All these factors should be pushing the U.S. to try to solve rather than manage this. And that's why when the shooting started, even though, again, Iranians are a highly nationalistic population, and who knows how long the ebbs and flows of support for a foreign conflict would have gone once bombs start to drop and once civilian casualties widen. But that's why the only thing you saw in the first few days of the conflict was jokes about the IRGC's incompetence, was welcoming, toasting, celebrating the Israelis dismantling the apparatus of repression inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is really something critical and misunderstood, because now, Iranians do feel a little bit betrayed. The regime now is moving into a position that I've been ringing the alarm bell about for a very long time, which is if you deal a significant but limited military defeat to these types of regimes, they will not have the wherewithal necessarily to continue the fight abroad. But they, like wounded tigers, wounded lions, will try to project strength at home. They've already rounded up over 700 people. On day one, the Iranian Injustice Ministry, not the Justice Ministry, the Injustice Ministry, spoke about going after people for their posts on social media that were even perceived to be in support of Israel or in support of Zionism. Whenever they do internet blackouts, that's when they go after Iranians. You know, Iranians die in the darkness. It's not just democracy that dies in the darkness. We've seen this from different periods of protest before. So fundamentally, it's been really painful as someone who, again, sees an opportunity for the US and Israel to align their head and their heart in the Middle East, which is often very, very hard to do. You often have to hold your nose and decide between strategy and values. You need not do that here, but those political handcuffs and those overlearned lessons of all those other foreign imposed regime change wars have, unfortunately, thus far, and hope maybe it'll change, but thus far led to us missing the forest through the trees here. Because there is a way in which the regime will limp along and crack skulls at home and use the uranium it's allegedly squirreled away, not to produce a weapon, but to live to fight another day and to take time, which is an element and a tool currently on Israel's side, currently on American side, and that used to be on the Iranian people's side, and move it from that side of the ledger to this side of the ledger and make it a tool again and have them build back better with potentially Russian or Chinese help down the line, or potentially once America pivots to Asia or Israel thinks it can go back to managing rather than solving these issues in the Middle East, then you have potential proxy resurgence across the whole host of failed states and war zones in the Middle East today. That is the real threat, that you leave in place this wounded animal who has this real capability to wreak havoc and destroy the most important strategic partner that Israel and America has in the Middle East, which is the Iranian people. So forgive me for foot stomping that so heavily, but it is very, very hard to see. I'm already seeing stuff from activists, former people who were in jail in Iran, who feel this used and abused sentiment, and you don't want that to percolate. You don't want that to proliferate. You want that to be the front lines of a much more united front against this Islamist transnational terrorist group that has taken a proud nation hostage. And it is a real shame that from a bunker, an 86-year-old ideologue was able to flesh out this aversion and this fear in us, even as his regime and his security apparatus and his military apparatus was crumbling. He knew us better than we knew us, and that is dangerous. So who knows where the conflict will go in the future, and who knows if he can continue to play to the edge like that. But he's lost a lot, but he's patient. This is a guy who is currently the Middle East's longest-serving contemporary autocrat. He didn't get to be that way by gambling it all away in one day. He certainly has an ideology. He certainly has put resources and assets to that ideology. But he does think he can ride the storm. And this has always been a 2 steps forward, 1 step back scenario.
Yeah, and actually that's such interesting insight. And it's also been sort of that bone of contention about military strikes on Iran, whether it creates that kind of wounded tiger scenario in which they just double down on building. They come out thinking they really need even more nuclear weapons. What are the chances? And I'm going to take this is from one of our listeners. How quickly, how hard would it be for Iran now to rebuild, reconstitute? Could it be a matter of months? Do we know?
Is that to Jonathan or to?
When you say reconstitute, you mean the nuclear program, or do you mean just
Nuclear.
like the nuclear program? Look, I'm not a nuclear specialist. I don't think Behnam would describe himself that way either. We have colleagues who, they deal with the physics of all of this.
Yeah.
But if the facilities are not there and the scientists are not there, the facilities that are required for weaponization and for conversion, all the things that have been destroyed or rendered inaccessible, it's really hard to imagine them doing this. But I think there's also just the question of will, that now that they see that the Israelis have the ability to fly right into their airspace and knock out whatever they want, And the United States doesn't seem terribly worried about flying a B-2 bomber equipped with massive ordnance penetrators and dropping them on targets. It's a high risk thing right now to consider going back to your nuclear program. Now, I can imagine that maybe they mothball it and they try to play for time. And I do think that that would be consistent with the way this regime functions, and to be able to sneak out at some point later with a program that's been reconstituted. But if you ask me, it's not happening in 2025. I'm doubtful that it happens in 2026. But so much of this right now hinges on what is secured at the negotiating table. There will be discussions that are soon to take place between Stephen Witkoff, the president's envoy to the Middle East, and the Iranian regime. And what is discussed there, what is secured there, will be crucial for the region. I can't stress that enough, that if we don't make all of the demands right up front and then push for them, right? I'm talking about the nuclear program. I'm talking about missiles. I'm talking about proxies. There are all these threats that the regime has posed to the region. If we don't neutralize those, then the future of the region still looks bleak, because it means that at some point Iran is able to claw back and build these things anew. And really what we need is, we need all of these things neutralized so that the Saudis feel comfortable normalizing with Israel, so that other countries in the region can live without fear of the regime, murdering their own, right? Countries like Lebanon or Iraq that have been taken over. I mean, the Iranian regime has been like a parasite to multiple Arab countries. And that's the kind of thing that we need to be able to prevent. And that's why I think these conversations coming up, these shouldn't be negotiations. These should be the terms of surrender that are mandated to the regime in Iran, right? You have lost. You got shellacked on multiple fronts. It is time for you to stand down, and here's what we're offering you when you do. That should be the mentality. I hope that's what Stephen Witkoff brings to the table.
I'm going to ask, so two more questions very quickly because we're at time, but I wanted to ask very quickly, Jonathan, first, do you think that that would include it, right? There's a ceasefire on, we don't know yet how sturdy it is. Any possibility that those discussions also end with a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of the 50 remaining hostages?
I mean, absolutely, it should be on the table, right? I mean, if what you're doing is you're leaning on Iran, and you're telling them that, what you've just done, this disaster that you've just brought to the region, you've just paid a heavy, heavy price. It's time for you to end all of it. And I tweeted this out the other day. I do think that one of the terms for the Iranian surrender, if they don't want to sustain more attacks from the United States and from Israel, then absolutely we should be calling for this. And by the way, I think the Arab world would welcome the idea that maybe we'd stop fighting in Gaza too, because that's exhausting for everybody, and people are deeply concerned about humanitarian issues and food and food security and everything else. So I absolutely see that as something that we should be thinking about. But again, I think the question really comes down to, do we have the will? And I'll just note, it's important to remember here that Iran is not the only patron involved in the hostage problem. We should also be leaning on the Qataris. We should be leaning on the Turks. These are the other two major sponsors of Hamas, and they haven't had to pay a price. But I will just say, just as maybe a fun way to end on my part, you look at these two primary sponsors of Hamas, Iran and Qatar. They were the ones that were the primary patrons of Hamas when this war broke out on October 7th, before everything else. And 600 days later, Iran's getting its nuclear program struck. But the postscript to all of this was just poetic, right? The two of Hamas's main sponsors find themselves at odds with one another. The Iranians start bombing Qatar because there's an American base there. And there is just something poetic about the fact that one Hamas sponsor ends up bombing another 620 something days after this war began. We need to put pressure on all of these thug countries. They're like, I mean, I can't stress enough. These are garbage nations that have supported anti-Semitic, vile, violent terrorist organizations. They all need to pay a price for it. And I hope that we have the spine to hold them to account, each and every one.
Okay, thank you for that, John. I'm going to go to Behnam, give him the last word. On a regional level, where we are now, we woke up this morning, are we in a better moment, a better Middle East, or with the potential of being a better Middle East than we were 2 weeks ago?
Two super quick footnotes to what John said. Just
Yep.
one is syntactical, but John knows sometimes I over-focus on the details. I would just make it garbage regime so they know that it's not the people, it's the
Correct.
political entities.
Correct.
Thank you.
Agreed.
And then the second is just on nuclear. This is maybe my obsession. It's misaligning or aligning ways, means, and ends. Stopping the bomb has to be a function of stopping the regime. At what point now, given the limited or moderately successful counterproliferation measures and steps the Israelis have taken against Iran's nuclear program and missile program, and the counterproliferation steps the Americans have taken against the Iranian nuclear program, at what point do you turn that into an Iran policy? At what point do you get to say, now that I've defanged this element of the threat, let me really foot stomp my leverage, let me really build my leverage at the negotiating table by having an actual counter-regime policy. You know, this is not just a quest for a nuclear weapon by some technical entity. This is a quest for a nuclear weapon by an anti-American, anti-Israeli state sponsor of terrorism, and it has to be seen through that lens. And if it's not seen through that lens, it'll color the impact it'll color the answer to your actual question about the impact on the region. Will we be in a better place or not? And I actually fear here that we don't have the data yet on that to be able to flesh out, because in the short to medium term, if the US or potentially the Israelis don't want to sink more cost into this, into the shaping exercise, into the hard stuff, into exercising the diplomatic muscle, which, full disclosure, the Middle East is littered with examples of military successes that have failed to translate into a better, more cohesive, more prosperous, more peaceful political order. That is now the task. Now, that is a task, if you tell anyone who works in the Trump administration, term one or term two, they will shy away from, because no American official can win votes with such a task, given the post-Bush experience in the Middle East. Not Obama, not Trump 1, not Biden, probably not Trump 2. And therein lies part of the contradiction for us. So I would love to have a clear answer to end with, to forecast that we'd be in a better place next year when it comes to the region. But we don't have all the data on that yet. And there, I think we need to be humble. But at the same time, there, I think we need to dream. You know, I'm a New Yorker. I just got back early this morning from New York, where I grew up basically all my life before coming down here for college and then working. And staying in a hotel right down near the World Trade Center, just thinking about the impact of this event on my life and on the lives of so many Americans. You can't disconnect the dots on these things. You can't disconnect the dots on the way the regime engages in the region versus the way the regime engages with the long arm of terror abroad. 11 Iranians were recently arrested by ICE. I don't know why that's not much of a bigger story. All I'm saying this is because we have to have a larger counter-Iran policy to make sure that these successes don't remain, footnotes, or don't remain confined to the whole host of other things that the region can always have in store for us. Because here we need to be humble, and here we need to actually, at the same time, have a little bit more imagination to drive and align those ways and those means and those ends. And the reason I mentioned 9/11, and John knows I, have over-focused here on Iranian ballistic missiles for quite a while, is the 9/11 Commission report actually said we never imagined that planes, that civilian airliners would be used as ballistic missiles. And now we have to dare to imagine that what could a better Middle East look like, and then get the political courage to build on these military successes for that better political order. Otherwise, I think time will move from one side of the ledger to the other, and some of the worst forces will be able to weaponize that time.
So well said. Yes, humble but hopeful. So I'm going to end it there on that hopeful note. Jonathan Schanzer and Behnam Ben Taleblu, this has been a great pleasure for us, and we have learned so much. We appreciate your comprehensive knowledge and your insight, and we hope that you'll be back to give us more of that in the months ahead. Thank you so much. And thank you as well to all of our participants today. We're so glad you joined us, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next Simon Wiesenthal Center special briefing. I wish everybody a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.